kind of responses? Will they be open-ended questions? Step 7 requires that we determine how many participants we need for our study. Generally, the greater the number of participants, the better. Step 8 requires that we determine how best to distribute our data collection instrument. In the case of a questionnaire, possible distribution options are in-person with paper and pencil, in-person electronic on a computer or tablet, or online sent as an email form or link. It is also necessary to determine who will be responsible for collecting the data. Will it be the responsibility of the principal researcher? Will coaches and/or others be recruited to help collect the data? Will the data collectors require special training? The final step, step 9, requires that we determine how the data will be analyzed. Is the goal to collect percentages? If yes, will these percentages be calculated using an application like Microsoft Excel? Or will we require specialized statistical software like SPSS? The application you use will in part be determined by the statistics you want to calculate. If your plan is to analyze the data beyond descriptive statistics, then a specialized statistical package like the Statistical Package for the Social Sciences, or SPSS, may be a better choice. Next slide, please. The final step is reporting your results. The best way to do this is to organize your results so that they line up with the research questions you asked. In the example on this slide, we asked questions that can easily be divided into 3 categories: knowledge, belief, and attitudes. For each section, we would repeat the main research question that we asked and then report the responses in the form of percentages if you're looking at descriptive data. We should be able to link each result to the original research question that we asked in step 2. And the response to those questions should easily provide a solution to the problem we identified in step 1. Following these steps will ensure that your research proposal is sound, it's linear, it's valid, and it's reliable. Thank you. I will now turn the presentation over to Dr. Kim Nolte, who will talk about working with partners.
Thank you very much, Gretchen. Good day, everyone. I hope you're finding the webinar informative. I will firstly be covering the section of the webinar that deals with working with partners. The 4 aspects that I will be discussing under partnerships include why we should collaborate, considerations for effective partnerships, involving athletes and athlete support personnel, and then fourthly, connecting organizations with research institutions. Next slide, please. So if we start off with why collaborate, the primary reason why we recommend collaborating specifically between the anti-doping organizations and the research institutions is because it is likely to increase the quality of research applications and outputs. Next slide, please. Let's have a look at how uniquely the anti-doping organizations and the researchers can contribute to ensure quality of research applications and outputs. The 2 parties have different skills, expertise, and contacts that can be beneficial. So firstly, if we have a look at the anti-doping organizations, they generally understand the operational complexities of anti-doping in sporting communities, which maybe the researchers or the research institutions don't have such a good understanding, perhaps. Also, they can help translate theories and frameworks into practice, which is what research is all about at the end of the day. They also have networks that you could possibly tap into and also help you to connect with athletes and support personnel. And lastly, they may have access to resources for social sciences research that can be helpful. Then, if we have a look at the researchers or the research institutions, one of their main responsibilities is obviously to conduct research, and therefore they should be proficient at conducting research and have a good understanding of the research process. So they can design and conduct research with academic rigor. They've also got an interest in testing theories and concepts, and they understand the current research methodology. And lastly, they have experience in writing research applications and disseminating outcomes. Next slide, please. So if we move on to then considerations for effective partnerships, because it's one thing to have a partnership, but if the partnership is not effective, then it is of no use. So I'll be looking at 4 aspects under considerations for effective partnerships, and that is shared understanding, mutual respect, commitment to partnership, and then lastly, the ability to adapt and compromise. Next slide, please. So if we have a look at shared understanding, the partners need to understand the exact nature of their partnership, their roles, and their contributions. So for example, is it a joint research project, or is one of the partners playing a more advisory role? So this needs to be clear. Also, the partners need to agree on the research project itself, the aim, the research questions, the process, the desired outcomes, and also the time frames. Often this is where problems arise if there's not agreement on these aspects. Communicate and agree on shared expectations. So open and clear communication in this regard is really important. And then lastly, provide a shared document which captures these factors. So something should be in writing that both parties have access to. Next slide, please. So if we have a look then at mutual respect, we have spoken about what the parties have to contribute. So it's important that we understand and acknowledge the respective areas of expertise. Also, it's important to clarify what each want to get out of the research and what they want to put in it. So how much time and effort are they willing to put into the research? And then lastly, proactively develop an agreed framework for resolving problems without damaging the collaborative relationship. Unfortunately, we know with research, problems do arise and there are challenges, so it's best to have a plan on how to handle these problems. Next slide, please. Then if we have a look at commitment to the partnership, the partners are more likely to be committed if they are involved in the partnership from the early phase, the concept phase of the research. Also, to make a purposeful commitment to the partnership from the beginning right to the end when the results of the research is disseminated. And then maintain a positive working relationship throughout. Again, this is not always easy, but to try and maintain this positive working relationship throughout the research project. Next slide, please. Then lastly, also the adaptability and compromise, because when it comes to research, it's almost guaranteed that there will be change and there will be challenges. So it's important to be transparent, and communication should be frequent through the change. And in addition to that, try to focus on agreed purpose and aims of the research in times of compromise. Next slide, please. If we move on then looking at involving athletes and athlete support personnel, I think sometimes we tend to forget the most affected by the research, and they have important perspectives and experience that can add real depth to our research. Next slide, please. So it's important that research that is conducted is athlete-centered. So we should engage and empower our athletes to contribute to anti-doping policies. Also try to build an easier anti-doping journey for our athletes and increase the contribution that our programs deliver for athletes and support groups so that they can build a healthy and sustainable career in sports. Next slide, please. So by engaging athletes and support personnel, we will likely increase the validity and the relevance of our research, and hopefully ultimately then improve the sporting experience for all the participants. Next slide, please. So my last slide in terms of partnerships is connecting organizations with research institutions. So we've looked at why we collaborate, what is an effective partnership, and also involving athletes and support personnel. But now it's important also to know how can we connect with each other. So yeah, it's just a bit of advice. So firstly, who is or who has conducted research in the field of interest? So trying to find out, looking at authors of articles, which research institutions were possibly involved. That can also be a way to help you to connect with the right individuals and institutions. Then you can also think about what research institutions and anti-doping organizations are most accessible to me, and what opportunities exist for me to build a network. So for example, are there maybe conferences that I can attend at which I can possibly network? And lastly then, WADA or other organizations can also help you to then connect with anti-doping organizations or researchers. Thank you. I'm going to move on then to the next section of my presentation, which is then the regional considerations for Africa. So in terms of compiling a research grant application and then also conducting the research. Next slide, please. The different regions and countries across the world are unique, and by unique I mean special or distinctive. There are 54 countries in Africa which are diverse. Therefore, there may be specific considerations when planning and conducting research. Next slide, please. So there's 4 aspects that I'm going to look at in terms of specific considerations. So the first one will be language. I'll also look at culture, geographic location could be a consideration, and then also technology. Research is a process, and these aspects may influence the various steps in the research process differently. In the first phase of research, these aspects may influence the quality of the research proposal as well as the outcome of the grant application. Next slide, please. So if we have a look at then language considerations, or just some of the language considerations, obviously official languages vary across regions and countries. Some countries in Africa have many official languages, For example, South Africa has 11 official languages. But if we have a look at how language can possibly influence the conceptual phase of the research process. For WADA's social sciences research program, grant applications must be done in either English or French. If either of these languages are not the researcher's first language, it may be difficult to write the research proposal. It is recommended then that language editing could possibly be done. Editing can, however, be costly, and therefore it may be beneficial to look into options available to the researcher. That is why, once again, collaborations may be very useful in this regard. Next slide, please. For fair representation of our diverse populations is obviously important for research projects. So just some practical applications when it comes to language. You need to consider some important research documents and what language those documents should be in. So for example, informed consent forms, questionnaires, etc. It's important, obviously, or essential that the participants really understand those documents. And should they be required in languages or different languages, and they may require translation. And the same goes for communication and dissemination of the results. Who will be the audience? And it may be necessary to have or to communicate in different languages. Next slide, please. Okay, we're just going to very briefly also look at some cultural considerations. And when I speak about culture, it's really referring to ideas, customs, and social behavior of a society. As we know, Africa has abundant and vibrant cultures. It is important for research to take culture into account. And also to keep in mind, cultures in Africa differ between countries, but it also can differ between different areas in one country. These diverse cultures may influence our sports practice and participation, as well as aspects of the research process. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, only a small percentage of global research is conducted by Africa. Hopefully, this trend is changing. A lot of research conducted in other parts of the world cannot be generalized to Africa. And this is also true for anti-doping sciences research. So although there is merit in replicating studies conducted in other parts of the world, there may also be specific cultural considerations that can influence the research topic, the project, and the methodology. Obviously, those who stay in certain regions or countries understand their cultural factors best. And once again, this also highlights why collaborations are so important. I've listed some examples that you can get you thinking of possible cultural aspects to consider, but these are really just a few. We may have unique ideas or beliefs regarding sports participation and competition, our use of traditional healers and herbalists, and maybe our unique diet may be something to consider when it comes to conducting research. Next slide, please. Then if we have a look at geographic considerations, there may be things that you need to keep in mind. Many projects benefit from involving different regions and countries. And we know, unfortunately, travel may be costly and can be costly and sometimes difficult. And therefore, it may also be useful in terms of collaborations with individuals in different areas and different countries, and then extensive travel may not be necessary. for the project. Next slide, please. Then there are also technical considerations. Unfortunately, research often requires an appropriate infrastructure, access to computers, and internet. This is a difficult barrier to overcome, but once again, collaborations may also assist in this regard. Also consider participants and their access to questionnaires and interventions, as this can also sometimes be problematic, especially for athletes that stay in remote areas. Next slide, please. And then my last slide is just on some general considerations for our region. So firstly there, we know that athletes can sometimes have problems in terms of access to facilities and services to improve their performance, and this may influence their training and possibly research projects that we want to conduct. Financial constraints of athletes in our community must also be considered. And I think obviously the COVID-19 pandemic, which has had a really negative impact in many ways, you need to consider the practicalities imposed by the pandemic and how it has also influenced our athletes and sports participation. I just wanted to also mention many of our researchers at research institutions have high workloads, and it's sometimes difficult to fit in their research. And this is also often a difficult challenge to overcome. But thinking about your collaborations and really your research assistance, this could also be very helpful. And lastly, just to consider the different tiers of application very closely. So what would be the most appropriate tier for your project? And possibly doing a smaller scale project initially. Thank you so much for your time.